Hey, it's Crumbs. You're lost? How do you not know where you are? It's Thorin's channel.
Right, this is going to be episode 46 of Narrative Wake, a talk show about League of Legends. And so this first segment is going to be centered around the EU LCS Gauntlet, where we had, for anyone who's not aware, the regional component where the number one team, which was the team who won Summer, automatically qualified, so Fnatic in this case. Then you have the number one team by circuit points, which in this particular case was Vitality. They then go through as the next seed, and then the third seed is decided by the Gauntlet, where the three, four, five teams remaining out of circuit points play each other in a gauntlet a la the LCK playoffs, as everyone knows how that works. That's the easiest analog to give. And as I always say, even though it's a bit backhanded, this is one of the best things I think Riot ever did. Like, pretty well, I'll tell you this, CSGO might be a better game than League of Legends to me and to many people, but we don't have a system as good as this for qualifying for our majors. We have a bizarre system where you get into the major based on placing top 8 at the last major, or if you don't place top 16, you have to go from the very beginning as though you were an absolute rank amateur team through an online qualifier into a small LAN, into another LAN. It's actually, believe it or not, League of Legends has a very robust, very good qualification system, which, to be fair, they should probably have had from day one because it already existed in South Korea to some degree. But whatever, they did bring it in by 2015, so I guess they've had a few years now where it's been legit. And this episode, we're going to start with the ULCS Gauntlet, and then we will make a seamless transition into another part of the show with a different guest in which we discuss the NALCS Gauntlet. So let's start out here. Our guest for this episode is Brokenshard. He's sat there, he's wearing an SK hat, because in case you're not aware, Brokenshard, much like Kikis, has been in either every single European organisation in League of Legends, or one day will be. It's like, there's only two situations. You've either had Brokenshard in a team, or one day you will. So, hello Brokenshard. You currently represent SK Gaming, yes?
Yeah, I coach their League of Legends team.
And about 2 years less than Kikis as well, so he makes the rounds very frequently.
Not bad. Not bad. Right, Brokenshard. What region do you actually think of as your home region? Because obviously you briefly played in the ULCS at times. NALCS was where you were doing some coaching, etc. What do you think of as your home region? You've been all over the place, right?
Europe, for sure, would be. I mean, that's kind of where I started playing. It's where I developed as a player. And I think it's also, in my opinion, Dignitas.eu was the greatest thing that I was able to, work with. And that was the challenger team that had Senkuk's Wonderwear, Kobe. Some of those players we're going to be talking about right now, yes, who have played in the Gauntlet. Actually, all of them actually played in the Gauntlet. And I think that was the biggest part of my career, at least. And that was in Europe, and that wouldn't have existed in NA, where I could pick up these talented players out of solo queue, because the solo queue situation in NA is pretty dire. There's only a couple, but in EU, Kobe, Senkuk's, and Wonder, we're just every other solo queue player, if that makes sense. And so that's what I consider EU, only in EU, and that's what I really enjoyed to do.
Okay. Right, Kelsey, coming into this Gauntlet, I noticed on the last episode, you were already pretty down on Misfits, right? So did you actually anticipate, though, that Splice would be able to beat them?
Yes.
Because obviously Splice is a team where you've had your own question marks around them over the split, although I guess obviously they played well at times. So where did you come down on this one? Why do you think it was so conclusive?
I felt so Misfits in particular, I think, if anything, the one series where they beat G2 was an anomaly. It was against everything else that had happened, and it was either because G2 were crashing super hard or because they had 2 off weeks, which I basically consider the seeding qualification, where there was the 3-way tie with Vitality, Schalke, and G2, and then, or it started at that point and then carried on into quarterfinals, or it was because they had a random uptick, right? And since I feel like Misfits problems have been pretty consistent, not just this split, but going back like kind of further even, where they've focused a lot on early game stuff when games get a bit longer, and then they can't necessarily figure out where they're going. Not all of their compositions give them answers for mid to late game setups of any kind. And I felt like it was much more likely that Misfits were just that G2 had an off week than that Misfits had suddenly fixed all of the problems that they had. So I was really, really down on them. Splice, I actually kind of felt like could easily even qualify for Worlds. So I felt like either Splice would beat G2 because G2 couldn't recover from like whatever was causing them issues before. Like we had Perks on previously and he said that there were internal problems. And I felt like if they didn't recover, then Splice could easily like make the final and then have a very good series against Schalke. I felt like against Schalke, like they just had to have answers sort of to mid to late game sideline pushes in their draft, and they could easily kind of like beat Schalke even. So I felt like it would be actually more one-sided, but obviously because Splice have a lot of issues with early game, it feels like at times they even give up on having an early game plan at all. Then it ended up being much closer than that.
Okay. Like Brokenshard, once upon a time, this very split, Misfits was meant to be the best European team. What's happened to this team?
It's like so for me, the big thing about Misfits that was always like a consistent factor was that Maxlor was performing like the best jungler in Europe for a majority of the split, specifically for the early game, and it kind of like their bot lane for the most part, Hansama was always very good, and when they were succeeding, Hansama was pretty much like dumpstering lane with Mickey X kind of like silently supporting it with like Morgana or something like that. But I think there was a slight meta shift, and you can kind of see it in the performance of Mickey X, where it's like these supports like the Morgana, while they're still somewhat viable, aren't as valuable as playmakers like Rakan, Pyke, Alistar, and Mickey X straight shit on these champions. And because I don't think Maxlor individually got worse, though his pressure was like felt less a little bit. Without like a playmaking support behind you, like if you think about the best teams in Europe, Fnatic, or you could say Schalke, Vitality, all of the supports on these teams are strong playmakers. Hylissang, Vander to some extent, and even Jack Troll are always following their jungler around with some CC support. Now, Mickey X straight up like didn't play well on like the Shen, the Rakan, the Alistar. And when the meta shifted to these champions, the bot lane stopped winning, which was a huge factor for Misfits' like strength, because Senkux, while good, was never like a top tier mid when you compare him to like Caps, Perks, Nuke Duck.
Sure.
Even Niski, like to some extent, was performing better than him. So now their bot lane wasn't a factor, and if Maxlor wasn't able to get like the support pressure, then the jungler was no longer a factor. And then so they stopped being able to pick up early leads, and then it kind of crumbled from there, because they didn't just like have any like strong pillar to go into the mid game on. That's how I saw it for them.
When you consider, Kelsey, that we did see obviously the whole Misfits playoff run and now this series in the Gauntlet, isn't it somewhat conclusive that like Senkux has had some champion pool issues here? Because we've seen him play a whole bunch of different ones, and it feels like in series he's one of the people who has problems.
Yeah, I think like in the G2 series was just something that I talked about in the previous episode, is that they kept blinding mid champs that Senkux can pick a comfort pick into. So like the Malzahar, he was able to pick twice, for example. So I think that that's definitely a factor to consider. I don't know what exactly happened to Senkux, because I felt like he was actually excelling on certain picks earlier on in the split that he isn't normally associated with. Like he had very, very good performances technically, just in terms of mechanics and understanding of the champion on things like Yasuo, like stuff like this. And it went very well for him. I remember that he used to actually kind of gravitate a little bit towards assassins. So there was, I'm not exactly sure like what happened in later on in the split for Senkooks, but he started to look a little bit less. Maybe he was just like really motivated going into the season. They just come back from Korea. He was putting in more hours or something like this. Like, I'm just obviously speculating. Yeah. But then as performance worsened, or they were having more trouble, he kind of lost a bit of motivation, and we saw a little bit more of the older Senkooks. So I think there is something to saying that like Senkooks actually looked really great. He looked like maybe at this halfway through the season, he looked like the most improved player from spring to summer in all of the EU LCS. So there is that to say, but against Niski, I don't think he's like ever really had like the greatest game ever. I don't know if it's a mind game thing almost, but then like you're in a position where Misfits are not a team that play well around top lane. They just don't do very well in top jungle 2v2s. I don't know what exactly causes them to make way more mistakes on that side of the map, but it happens a lot. They'll do invades, they'll mislead the enemy, they'll misread what the enemy jungler is doing in invade after like camps are taken and not actually have any vision to put down, so they're just wasting time when they do those sorts of things. Or they'll just like completely mechanically misplay a 2v2 where they should win. So it's just really weird that they have so much trouble playing around topside. And then if mid is losing a lot, you basically only have one lane. And if Splyce specifically target and draft things that will give them a lot of pressure and a lot of playmaking ability in the bottom lane, then I think it becomes much more difficult for Misfits to find a win condition. And since they rely so much on this kind of early game setup, then it's really difficult in general for them.
What did you think, Brokenshard, of the Splyce bot lane getting the same exact bot lane champions 4 games in a row? Now, obviously, they split games, it was 2-2, but what do you think of that?
I mean, I'm not really sure what to think about that. Like, I know that Kobe, I don't think Kobe's a bad player. I think he's actually really good, and giving them Varus 4 games in a row is like, Varus is just broken, in my opinion. I don't think it has to do like with the same champion. I think the fact that they were given Varus 4 games in a row when Misfits is like, as Kelsey was saying, like a team that does rely on the early game is really stupid. Like, why aren't Misfits the one playing the Varus? Misfits were blue side for majority of the series, and Varus was open. It's a clear first pick, and it's a really broken champion for lane priority and lane dominance. Maybe Misfits bot lane was expecting the Splyce bot lane, which has always been kind of like a little bit weird in terms of how they play. Like, they've always been like solid, but never overwhelmingly good. They didn't maybe expect them to be able to use this Varus super well, but Kobe and Kasing actually really popped off, and they were getting like 2v2 kills in lane with this pick. So I feel like there should have been like an adaptation somewhere down the line to stop giving away, because the initial idea made a bit of sense, but as soon as they started losing in lane to this, they should have just like, all right, enough, no more, none of this.
I actually would complain much more about the support picks, because I don't necessarily think Kasing has a very effective range of champions he can play. Tahm Kench is one of them, and if Misfits want to play a lot of like playmaking supports, a lot of like more aggressive supports, then Tahm Kench typically does well in lane. They don't necessarily get the priority. They can't do what they like to do, which is have jungle and support like influence mid lane. And then so Tahm Kench kept going over to Splyce in drafts, and they ended up in a situation where it just didn't kind of like, it was very difficult for them to kind of play the way they wanted to play at that point.
Yeah, like if we're looking at the draft, the first 3 games, the bans were basically identical. It was Gragas Braum Morgana for Misfits, Draven Rakan Kalista into first pick Urgot, then Splyce just picked Varus Ornn, and Misfits picked Kai'Sa Alistar twice, and then Tahm Kench was just picked 3rd. But I think that this is something that's super easy for Splyce to do when they get like something like Varus. They can just get support counter pick, and what else are Misfits really going to pick when Varus is taken out? Because they can't Xayah Rakan. I mean, they can't really pike, because then they'll just lose to the Varus Alistar. So I think they just had to go Kai'Sa Alistar. But at that point, it's like, we don't really have early game pressure. We're going to be pushed in lane, and then maybe like 30-35 minutes to the game, we'll have a stronger team fight set up. So I felt like the Braum Morgana ban kind of like, it almost like pushed them into like this hole where they had to pick something, otherwise they'd end up losing a lot more than just a bit of lane pressure.
Okay. Over the split, what do you make, Brokenshard, of Niski? It seems like someone where this year has really rehabilitated his rep and people seem excited about him now.
I think he's like super up and down. There's like a lot of people who say, oh, Niski's not good, he's overrated. When he was in NA, he had some really good performances. Like I can think back to like a particular Lucian game that he had on Envy when Envy was a shit show. But he was still popping off and doing a lot of good stuff. So in NA, I think it's kind of like when he started, but there have been a lot of ups and downs. But now I think that when it comes to playing like these aggressive mid laners, like the Ryze Cassios, Akali LeBlanc, Niski's an insane playmaker. Inconsistent maybe, but when he's on his highs, and like in the Gauntlet, he was definitely on some of his high moments, he's ridiculously good as a mid laner. I think he's still got a decent amount of time before he really needs to like step up, and he has time to fix his consistency. He could be one of the great mid laners, but right now I definitely like rate him upper tier, and is like a very streaky kind of player, I think.
I would say Niski struggled a bit more in spring when you could afford more bans on mid laners. I felt like in summer you didn't necessarily. There were always like some kind of OP champs they had to ban out that weren't always mid laners, and so he could get Zoe consistently. But that sort of gave him a time to be comfortable and sort of improve a lot in the role that Splice had given him, which I think is much more of a flexible role, much more of a role player type role. And so he kind of like filled the holes that Splice had in terms of, okay, we're a team that loses early a lot. I can be someone who can make the really surprising plays and get the good picks for my team, and we can get in back into the game on that. And I think that allowed him to kind of like really find a place where he was confident. And so you have seen, whereas I felt like Senkook's, just his improvements at the beginning of the split came out of nowhere and sort of were a flash and then they disappeared. Niski had like consistent growth throughout the summer, whereas previously I was never really high on Niski, and I didn't necessarily think he was going to be a standout player. I felt like this summer he made definite improvement and definite growth. So
okay. So after that, we had another 5-game series where this time Splice went head-to-head with G2. Right, Brokenshard, G2 is a team where obviously the pedigree, the name suggests they should be one of the best in Europe, but they had quite a shocking performance in the playoffs this time around in summer. Some people probably thought, I think most people probably had them favoured to win this match, but probably maybe had them losing to Schalke. Where did you see G2 at, and what did you think of G2 Splice?
What do you think of G2 in general, or just like the series? Yeah. So I think that, like, if you think about the types of players that are on G2 and the way that they played, they abused the concept of like mage meta and funnel super well, and they adapted to that meta in a way that got them a lot of wins, like the whole Jankos Braum thing. But in a way, it was kind of like a blessing in disguise, because as soon as it started going back to jungle mid, and jungle mid being like an important factor again, Jankos kind of dropped the ball, and I wouldn't say he definitely didn't have a very good split at all, and like looking like one of the worst junglers in the league in terms of like what he was doing, engages and stuff. But in this series in particular, there were a lot of moments where it's kind of like you kind of saw a bit of old Jankos back, and he started playing, I would say, quite significantly better. But even then, G2 definitely doesn't look like they made too much progress within their problems, because they reverted back to the thing that was winning them games, which was 1-3-1, Yarnin on mages. Like Wadid Tom Kench was a really big pick for them, because of the way that they like to play their split push. Wonder is probably still and is like the best carry top player in EU, and he does heavily favor those carries. So like the Urgot Flex and Aatrox meta suits him very well, and then that type of style suits Perkz as well, because Perkz is like one of those the players that can really pop off, but he wasn't really able to because he didn't have like a good support from his jungler like other mid laners did. I wasn't too pleased with the Splice series, to be completely honest, but at least G2 have like this fallback where it's like you still kind of need to Mannheimer Dinger against them, and it's kind of gimmicky. Yeah, at least like the big thing for me in the G2 Splice series is that Yankos is starting to like play like a human being again.
Based on how Splice play, I would say one of the biggest flaws, even though they are a mid to late game team, in how they think about mid to late game is that in their drafts and in their play, it's not important to them to have a champion that can answer a really strong hyperscaling side lane split pusher. This was something that Schalke abused. This was something that G2 can naturally abuse in the way that they like to play out games. So for me, it was like you look at these drafts and it's like, okay, we were picking a tank who wants to push a river and then group with the team and look to force over and over again. But if you're a team that can get advantages in the laning phase and then kind of like play around the map well, I wouldn't necessarily say that G2 is that team, but G2 kind of naturally want to be that team, and the setup that they have with like Wonder and Perks and a bottom lane that is more suited to playing utility-based kind of AD carries, which is very good for this meta. The fact that they approach Splice's slow push setups by just sending someone to answer the wave really when it gets late, and then see like, oh, okay, they're sending a stacked wave to us on one side of the map. We can rotate and catch that whenever we want, and we can use the intermeeting period to get picks, to set up Baron, to do all these things. It's a lot, I think, more freeing for G2, even if I wouldn't necessarily say that they are the greatest team in the 1-3-1. So,
yeah, go on.
No, they're not a good team at 1-3-1, but it's kind of like what they like to play.
Yeah.
And then they tend to gravitate towards it more. And I agree with you. Like, it's very interesting that like Odamne, I guess the last two series was basically just like you are on tank duty every single game, and it's like I'm looking at just the Leaguepedia drafts and I'm just remembering, oh yeah, they're fucking last picking Maokai into, they already can see it's like Aurelia Rise. So they already know like, oh, this isn't going to be very fun for Mr. Maokai or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think if they're just going to do that, why didn't they just like blind pick early top laners like early and then let Niski get a counter pick? Because I remember like a particularly painful game 4 where he's playing Castio into Aurelia and it's just not a fun matchup to play. So when Niski, if they're like, okay, Odamne, you're on tank duty, why are they just like ending up last picking Maokai? And is what I don't understand. And it didn't make much sense to me why they're putting Odamne on safe champions and then leaving his priority in pick order later more than the importance of like having a strong mid laner or a good counter pick matchup for Niski, which was what it seems like they were trying to make him like the main carry force of this team in this series.
What about, so obviously as you referenced, the Heimerdinger is the pick that jumps off the page because obviously your AD carries playing it in the period where actually people generally aren't playing mages bot lane anymore, and it was a specific pick that Yarnan had already shown some aptitude on earlier in the split. So since it was picked in the final 2 games, G2 won the final 2 games, he did fairly well, and it ended up having a knock-on effect on the next series where Schalke basically just banned it all the time. Right, was this as standout a pick as it sounds like when you say it like that? Like, was this a game changer in terms of the series? Is there a solution that could have been come up with for in the game? What was their solution like? These sorts of topics.
As Brokenshard mentioned earlier, I feel like G2 are kind of in the same position they were like last split in terms of where their weaknesses are, where their strengths are. But G2's bot lane is in a much better position pick-wise in terms of what they can choose. Obviously, if we're sticking specifically to AD carries, they will play the Jhin, they will play the Varus, they will play the Ashe, they will play these types of... The Sivir is also a Yarnan standby, though it's not like very meta. It's kind of fringe
whatever.
Meta. Yeah. Like he'll pick those types of picks, and which you can pick freely right now. Like almost all of these types of picks are really good. And then in this position, I feel like it was less about the Heimerdinger pick and more about, okay, we can have something that clears waves and will prevent a force on our 3 setup in our Rise Aurelia comp, and we can just kind of let it get to the point where Splice will not pick good answers to side lanes. Splice will not super hard pressure the solo lanes in the mid to late game. So as long as we have Heimerdinger, we have this threat that prevents them from doing team fights that are really, really strong against us, and then we can just kind of like squeeze them out. It's not exactly how the game's played out, but I think that that's generally the thought process where the Heimerdinger was, but it was still felt more like Wonder and Perks were doing the work in those games.
Even though like those champions like Heimer isn't meta, I wouldn't say it's not meta. It still works for the same reason it worked before, where it's some of the marksmen that people wanted to play just don't have the right toolkit or answers to deal with those champions. One thing that did really well into Heimer was like the Sivir, like you mentioned, or like the Ezreal. But I don't like the way that Splice responded to it. They picked Jhin in both games. No. They picked Varus in the first game, which is all right. But the Tahm Kench made it difficult for the Varus to do much. And then they picked Jhin Tahm, which in itself is a solid lane, but it also lends to the fact that if you're running Jhin Tahm, that is also a 1-3-1 side lane-esque composition, and that's not how Splice play the game. When they're picking... Yeah, you can go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were done. I was just saying another thing that helps them a lot is that obviously a lot of Heimer lanes, it's easy to get prio on. And G2 kind of look the best in the early game when they can play around the blue buff. They really like doing that. And so if they're on blue side, they have Heimer. They can set up to invade blue buff very seamlessly. They can rotate that pressure mid. They're really happy with that kind of play style. So yeah, it works out for them in the early game, and it works out for them in the mid to late game.
And then that also kind of is emulated in the way that they played with Jankos, is that Jankos was actually being proactive. He had Olaf both game 4 and 5, the games that they won with the Heimer. So that's like a champion that's like, oh, you have to really do something in the early game, and that's good because, like, I mean, he was so shit for so long up until now when it's like finally the guy's using his hands properly, and that's good to see. But one thing that worries me about G2, and I don't remember specifically who said it. It was like another, I think like a challenger player. It's like G2 needed to pick Heimerdinger to win, and they're banning Kai'Sa 5 games in a row. They just don't play this champion. They're not going to be a very strong representative at Worlds, and they're a weird team per se, but I wouldn't necessarily that they're a bad representative. They're just a strange one.
Let me give you put a pin in that a second, unless it's a key point you want to say now, in which case go ahead.
No, go for it.
Okay, right. So what I wanted to ask was this is like, whatever you want to call it, silver logic, Reddit logic. Here's the question for you, Brokenshard. So I can show you objective proof that Perks is a motherfucker on Kai'Sa, and a very, very strong player. So why not pick the Kai'Sa, rotate it into the bot lane, and have Heimerdinger mid lane? There's the Reddit logic / silver analysis. Right, explain to me why you wouldn't do that.
It's just the dumbest thing I've ever
I know it is, but why not? Come on, give me the reason.
Because okay, there's a big difference with playing Heimerdinger mid lane and there isn't playing it bot lane. It's like it doesn't work the same.
But on the scoreboard, it looks exactly the same.
I think the matchups for Heimer are not as good mid either. Yeah. For one thing, for sure.
And another thing is that Kai'Sa is not a lane dominant champion, and like the thing is that the funnel comp, what it did was it just like negated the entire lull of the early game that Kai'Sa would have in the lane. But when you're putting her bot lane, and you're not only just putting her bot lane, you're putting your strongest, like maybe not your strongest, but you're one of your best fucking players in a matchup where it's like, okay, you're going to sit there and you're going to farm and you can't do anything other than that. Like, why would G2 want to do that? Like, just to make one pick work doesn't make any sense. And then you're putting Hjarn in mid lane as Heimerdinger, where he's just going to get repeatedly just like banged by the enemy jungler, mid laner, and support. Because now that you're putting a losing bot lane, so now their support gets prio on you. So your poor Heimerdinger is just going to get banged mid, and it doesn't work because he's easily abused in mid lane. Whereas in bot lane, you're like support. If they try to all in you, you just buy time for Heimer, and then his turrets just kind of like kill you. It's cheesy, and I don't think it fits the way that G2 want to play, because they're not bot centric, and they never will be bot centric as a team. they've always been top mid centric in the way that they played.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the phase of the game, obviously top mid, those are the players they want to rely on to carry them through the game. But if they're picking like strong bot lane champs, like the Varus, like the Heimer, like the Jhin, which they'll play more and more, then like they'll use those to invade blue buff. They'll use those to have support rotate mid, and they can be semi bot centric in that way. But I would never consider them a team that wants to play out the Kai'Sa. To that effect, I think it was very lucky for them that Splice and Schalke were the teams that they faced, because Splice and Schalke are going to not really be teams that want to contest the mid sides, or they are, by sides I mean like if they want to set up a 1-3-1. Splice and Schalke are not going to be teams that are going to play extremely strong bot lanes because they want to have scaling bot lane setups. So they won't necessarily like really punish G2's bot lane in that regard either. So as long as they don't opt into group scenarios and they keep really good, which I think a strength of G2 is really good deep vision in the early game, and their transitions from, okay, we have ward and river, we're going to use that to push out and then rotate the wards here, which I think like Schalke and Splice are missing to an extent. It is really good that they face these types of teams. However, most of the really, really strong teams from other regions will not be the same as Splice and Schalke. So.
Okay. Right, Brokenshard. If Splice had somehow pulled out Game 5 here and won, who would have won the Gauntlet?
Splice.
They would have beaten Schalke, you think?
Yes, I think so.
Wow.
I think that I know that after Schalke lost, a lot of them came out and tweeted like, "Oh, we just didn't have any energy left in the tank," and in a way, it kind of showed in the way that they played. Like, amazing. I think that like, and here's maybe it's a slightly unpopular opinion. Like, I think that amazing is just like, he's had some games where he's just like legit so trash. His pathing is off. The way that he ganks is off, and he just like gives up early advantages. And it kind of showed in this game. Like in this game 3, when he picked like the Trundle and stuff, he was just like running it down in a lot of that game. And I think that they are plagued a little bit, at least the way that Schalke played, and the way that they do limit themselves to picking tank tops. And while VeXii is good in the tank matchups into some carries, I think that that's kind of fits into the way that Splice want to play, which is also just tank be tank. So I don't necessarily see how Schalke would have picked up on any early advantages, when I think that Xerxes amazing is an interesting one because both are quite inconsistent, but I rate Xerxes, at least the way that they were playing in the Gauntlet, a lot more than amazing. And that's like a really like hard, I would say, to like specifically pinpoint, like, because it's a hypothetical best of 5, but the way that Splice were playing and then the way that Schalke played against G2 wouldn't have added up very well for Schalke. I think that Splice would have been able to take quite big advantages over the way that Schalke were playing.
Okay, you agree, Kelsey?
I think that Splice would have a lot more freedom in how they want to play out the game at Schalke. I'm not 100% sure that it would be like very, very one-sided. Obviously, Schalke were in a particular scenario where they said that they didn't have a lot of energy, so probably Splice wins regardless. But I do think that Splice, in terms of like one of my biggest issues with Schalke is that they do not set up for neutrals very well. So a lot of people think Poppy is so good for them because VeXii is like an insane mad Poppy player and he beats them in matchups that he shouldn't win in, and he's just like the best Poppy ever. But a lot of it is just that some of their setups for objectives are so sloppy that if they can use Poppy to kind of like counter engages that enemy teams set up, they'll often send like someone lone, and in this series it was typically Vander to check like these types of neutrals. And then if it's the Poppy, then obviously he can completely like screw over the entire setup with the ult, or using his knock-up negation or anything like this. So it's really, like for me, this was a big fundamental core problem for Schalke, and I think that Splice would be able to take advantage of that fairly well, because I do think that their like vision around Baron, their stuff like this is very systematized, very well thought out. So for me, that was like the bigger core issue. The other thing is that everyone knows how Schalke plays their early game, how they telegraph their early game. If they have a strong mid lane matchup, then they can win the game. If they don't, then I don't really think they do, which is why like Nukeduck plays all these champions. He counterpicks everything. Yes. He saves these types of things. It's like a lot of amazing success comes off of him being able to like challenge the river fights really well if Nukeduck has prio, right? And it like I don't see a scenario where at a point teams don't realize that that's what's happening. And I think the Vitality series was definitely a tipping point, and you saw the way that Splice drafted against them, and they were already kind of aware that this was happening. So I think Splice would win.
Okay. Just adding also as well to like the way that you're talking like the sloppy setup and stuff like that. A lot of the way that Schalke was taking wins in the regular season, like specifically even I guess you're remembering this against your own team, that fucking Poppy play, and everyone was like, oh, it's the greatest Poppy play of all time. I'm like, that shouldn't have happened. Like Schalke should have lost the game there. And the only reason that they were able to get into that dragon pit was because, VeXii pulled out a hero play. And then, in a way, I would say that it kind of became, like, really gimmicky. It's like, oh, just give him Poppy and he'll pop off on it. And it's, no pun intended, sorry. But, like, I guess they kind of relied on individual outplays that shouldn't happen rather than concrete setup and planning. And when those individual outplays stopped happening later into the season, like later into their playoff run and the Gauntlet, teams with better planning were just always going to be better and always going to take advantages over them. So I definitely agree in like what you were saying. I don't think Splice would have given them those opportunities.
To tie into what you were talking about there, Kelsey, can you like give us some more information on the Nukeduck scenario there? Because people will have seen where it was brought up numerous times. I think it was 18 champions or something he'd played over the split and the playoffs and all the rest of it, right? How was this actually employed? Like, was the logic that he could just... He had so many matchups, he could always get a weird counter pick? Was the logic to sometimes blind pick champions, therefore to give a pick to someone else? Like, how were they actually trying to like use this as an advantage in the team?
Yeah, I mean, it was most often they would, as much as possible, wait until they could get a counter pick mid. This didn't always happen for them, right? Because they'd be on blue side, people would save their mid lane pick for last or something like this, which is a really easy way to kind of work around Schalke's draft plan, because Schalke also like their side lanes, I also felt ended up relying on a very limited pool of picks. Like you had Upset playing Ezreal in a ridiculous amount of games. You had VeXii playing Poppy in a ridiculous amount of games. So they felt like there were picks that their top and bot could just blind. And then those would be, and Braum also ended up being like a really huge pick. Where they could just blind these picks and then they would be safe, because like you can't really gank a Poppy or Braum very easily. And then like that, since Nukeduck was absorbing so many bans, right? Because it's like they saw, okay, this guy is ridiculous in the early game, we have to ban this, this, and this, or like he'll just take over the map. So they could consistently get these kind of picks, and then Schalke could just play through mid, and whenever mid had an advantage, they would invade Raptors, they would contest Scuttles, and they would get leads in that regard, and that allowed kind of Amazing to constantly be winning 2v1s instead of 1v2s, because if you think about like the way the map is set up, if you're fighting around mid, if your mid laner can react faster, you always have to think, okay, this is a 2v1, right? This is not a 1v1. So that's how I felt Schalke won the Vitality series, and that's how Schalke did well in most of their games. So,
in a way, I'd say that like the way that Schalke was drafting and the way that like their strategy went out would have fit really well with what Splice was doing, would have wanted to do, where it's like Nukeduck is a ridiculously strong laner, and then they were just like consistently giving him counterpick, and since his pick came down so late in the draft, he always ended up like not only being able to pick like the standard meta champion, but if he had some kind of pick that worked better, like a Lissandra, for example, he could be able to pick that. And I would have liked also like if they were just gonna pick tanks and pick like those basic carries in bot lane and tanks in top lane, then last pick mid always worked for them. And wouldn't you agree that like that would have worked? Like that's that draft strategy basically what we would have wanted to see from Splice more often?
Yeah, I think it would have been better for Splice in certain setups. I think that Splice were drafting more like that in their series against Schalke because they were kind of more aware of what Schalke were after. Like you saw, I'm trying to find so I don't misspeak, but like you saw more often, I think, Splice were counterpicking mid. Like they would pick the Cassiopeia, for example. They were saving their mid pick more in the series against Schalke, which I think is a good thing to do and a good way to adapt. But I also think that against G2, they probably thought, okay, we know G2 love to play around top, right? They love to invade on top side and have Wonder and Jankos operate as a duo, and that's some of their best games are like that. And they just kind of forgot about the spring G2 that loved invading blue buff when they played on blue side. That kind of operated much more around mid, and that was sort of a blind spot for them. And then even though they were saving picks for counterpick top, they didn't necessarily want to pick things that were good into this, or there isn't really a good answer in lane to Aatrox regardless. So maybe they just weren't prepared for something like Aatrox. So
what do you think, Brokenshard, in a world in which there's all these different champions Nuke can pick, that he's played, that he's won on in the split, what do you think about Game 5 coming down and picking Azir as his champion there? Not something that's picked very often in EU LCS, not a strength of his even necessarily. What did you think of this pick?
I mean, I didn't like it for him, but in the sense is like, maybe did they think that it's like a GP and Cassio flex because Azir does decent into both? But if you're wanting to like go toe to toe with a Cassio, Ryze was open, and I know lots of people say that Cassio is like a counter to Ryze, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily a hard counter. It's more of like a 50-50 matchup, and there's ways that you play around it in both
skill
sides.
Matchup, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily skill matchup. Like there's periods in the lane where Ryze is good and Cassio is good, and it's all about like But I don't. So if it was another mid laner, Azir could have worked, but I don't like it for Nuke Duck. It's not what they're trying to get out of him, and they're trying to take control of a game, and Azir is not that pick. There's a few other champions that they could have gone, like Irelia was open, which is really good into Cassio. Orianna was open, Syndra was open. Maybe they just didn't want to pick like something that was like that could easily just get run down by Olaf, or is as vulnerable to GP ults, like something immobile, or can get hit by the Rakan. And it's like their picks were slightly more limited there. And I actually think that maybe they wanted to avoid picking the Irelia simply because the last time that they played Irelia into something like Xayah Rakan, that was the Fnatic series, and it didn't go so well. Like Nuke got super far ahead in lane, and then didn't really have the impact in team fights. So I guess maybe they were just like a bit shell-shocked and thinking, don't get baited, pick something longer range that can deal the damage, at the expense of the fact that Azir isn't a hard counter to Cassio. It wins the lane maybe, but it's a slow as hell champion, and it's not the way that Schalke want to use their mid lane. I think that they were kind of like, at that point, it was like a mentality thing that pushed them towards Azir more than anything.
Kind of, I look at the Azir Curse and Cho'Gath setup, and I think, okay, they just want to all in on the first Baron, which feels like a kind of a desperate thing to do. So, I mean, that's kind of how I read their draft. Azir does kind of can get prio a bit more easily early on than Ryze can. So, like, that was really important to them. So, I don't know. I'm guessing that was more their thought process. But it definitely didn't work out. I didn't like the Skarner pick a bit more. I feel like G2 actually had pretty good answers to Skarner. So
I think that Olaf pick with the Trundle ban is like a huge thing that no one really is touching on, because like knowing that Amazing's champion pool, the way that Schalke utilize Amazing as a player, he is going to stick along this like trinity of like Sejuani, Olaf, Skarner, with the addition of Trundle, Olaf into the meta. Those things have to be considered. So when you pick Olaf and you take away the Trundle, Olaf's bad matchups initially instantly just become like unique picks like Kha'Zix, Nidalee, Graves, which is not stuff that they would particularly play. So it's like, okay, you're stuck now playing Skarner into Olaf, where you kind of have some advantage level 6, but it's fringe at best, and it's not like something that it's not like a 2v2 winning 2v2 that I would say Schalke can really abuse. So I would say it's less about the Azir pick, Thorin, and it's more like this Olaf pick with Trundle ban kind of abused the way that Schalke used their jungle so hard, and they couldn't adapt and put Amazing on like a carrier that could abuse this Olaf.
Okay. Right, since you alluded to it when we were talking about the past series, I mean, G2 winning the Gauntlet has everyone hyped. Perks looks amazing, you know, there's all these factors. Why are you kind of like a bit tempered on them going actually towards Worlds here, Brokenshard? What's the issue? Why can't they be a good team? I mean, by the way, I will say Perks himself even said he thinks all the EU teams are going to do shit at this World. So I will say, you know, he sort of said it himself.
I think that there's a lot to be happy about in G2 going to Worlds. Like Perks Wonder Yankos are very good players in the role. Well, I say Yankos because like traditionally he has been good, but he could be really good. But this at least in this summer, I think this is the 4th time I'm saying it, he really sucked. And I mean, obviously, like if he's watching this, like I'm sorry, but you did suck. I want to see you play well, but just don't be shit, and I'll say that you're not shit. But the thing about G2, and like I said, like, yeah, you're right, in a way that they are bot-centric, in the way they are and in the way they aren't. Where it's like they'll use bot prio to get advantages on the map to go to mid, but they'll never use advantages elsewhere and bring it to bot lane. And then try to win the games through their bot lane, which I think makes them very one-dimensional, for example, and can lead them to problems against not necessarily play-in teams, but teams of higher caliber, like almost any LPL team or maybe even an NA team or two might be able to take games off them, because the way that G2 draft is that they want to 1-3-1 and then use bot early game advantages to get advantages early to bring to mid top. But they'll never actually really try to win the game specifically directly through the side lane. It might fall victim to teams who are able to circumvent that or not let them take those advantages. So I'm a bit concerned that they're a one-trick pony in that sense, and that their style is very, very telegraphed and is going to be shown more and more in the play-ins, because they will have to play in play-ins, right? And there are going to be some teams in there that are really shit. I don't necessarily think they're going to get kaboomed by Kaboom, who are actually in the play-ins. But I don't have much hopes for G2 past that. I think I don't know. I don't see them making it out of groups. I don't think that's like the team to be excited about in EU.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think the fact that they're one-dimensional is damning, because there are a lot of teams at this tournament who are going to be super one-dimensional. I do think the fact that, like, as you said, they want to like draft these 1-3-1 comps, but they're not super sure how to play them, right? They seem to kind of rely on getting ridiculous leads and then team fighting with their non-team fighting compositions based on having lanes set up in a certain way. And it's like really awkward to watch at times. I also think that they are kind of good in a sense at relying on enemy teams like setting up good stacks, like the fact that Splice will almost always like slow push or stack their wave on the bot side, and then G2 just kind of like take the wave, and then they win out by not having to force fights that way. They wait for teams to force against them. They're not very good at knowing what to do. After the game transitions, they'll kind of stagnate a bit and wait for like Vander to walk into Baron Pit, and then they'll just kill him or something, and then win off of that type of thing. So I feel that G2 can be like really indecisive, not really know when to pressure their side if they have like a huge top lane advantage. So that to me is like, okay, they're one-dimensional. Plus, they're not very good at execution in what they profess or what they seem to be the best at. So that's kind of more my issue with G2 overall. I do think that they have a better chance at doing well at Worlds than Schalke or Splice, and they provide more variety than something Schalke or Splice would have. So.
I think that's also something that I should have mentioned as well. It's like in comparison to Schalke and Splice, G2 definitely would do better, but it's like the thing is, like, you're right, there are a lot of one-dimensional teams, but I think that even the one-dimensional teams have shown like a willingness to adapt. G2 haven't really shown that they're willing to even try a different style, and maybe that's something that they're going to work on in their boot camp. But if we're comparing them, to G2 to like Splice, Schalke, Misfits, they're definitely going to do a decent amount better, but I don't think that they're going to do as well as, say, Vitality or even Fnatic.
What do you think of the quality of play in the Gauntlet for this one?
Do you want to go first, Kelsey?
I think I wasn't insanely surprised by anything. So that's like good in some ways and bad in others, because I feel like no team like really, really hard underperformed in Gauntlet. And I mean, I guess like Schalke were a little bit below their level, but overall they still had similar tendencies. G2 were a little bit above, were a pleasant surprise because they had fixed like some of their issues from like their 2-week slump. But at the same time, it's just kind of like I didn't necessarily think the third seed from Europe, regardless of who they were, would be someone you could like really, really expect to make a huge splash at the World Championship.
Yeah. It's kind of like this is just like the third team going there. I think level of play in Gauntlet wasn't necessarily low, but it also wasn't necessarily high. Like ideally, what you'd want from like a good close game, five game series is like whichever team has the lead is going to take that lead and then like win the game off that lead. So like that would be like the ideal point. But it's like if a team got a lead, didn't necessarily mean that they were going to win the game. And that was, I think, why it was really back and forth and why we had 14 total games in the Gauntlet. Almost all series went all the way. And that doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, the teams are playing shit because they're losing games, but it's more like maybe the level was a lot closer than people expected. For me, the surprise, or not so surprise, was something that I was really happy about was Spy Spot Lane. I was just really happy to see Kobe almost like basically popping off and doing super well, specifically into what people considered like one of the better bot lanes in EU, Hansama and MickeyX. Even though I don't think they are, a lot of people seem to believe that they were. Just a strong dual lane. That was, I would say, the surprise for me.
I would say that Hansama and MickeyX I would say that MickeyX is a really strong support player relative to Kassane. But I think that that's kind of more where the strength of the bot lane lies, because obviously support has a lot of strength and dictates in lane. I wouldn't necessarily say that Hansama is the greatest laning AD, but he does prefer those types of champion picks. And so he could play like the Dravens and the Kallistas, which specifically Splice banned, and then get a lot of strength off of having good support and playing like these types of really front-loaded champions.
Do you still believe that thing about MickeyX being a strong support, even despite the performance in the series?
Yeah, I still do. I don't necessarily think we saw matchups where he had initiative, like because he's playing like Alistair and stuff into Tom Kench. So I still think he is a strong support. Like I don't think this was his best series ever, but I still think he's like a very strong individual support. He obviously, like he's even admitted, the team's admitted, has issues in being vocal, which obviously you can really knock a support for having problems with that, because that's one of their biggest jobs, because they don't necessarily play like the most mechanically intensive champions.
It's a different play style. Yeah, I get you.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it depends on like the AD carry as well. Like MickeyX, I think, is more suited to different AD carries, or maybe Hansama could be the vocal one in the lane. But yeah,
I do. I still do think that MickeyX is really strong support in terms of just like individual ability. I think that Misfits as a team really struggle with vision control. And I think that Misfits as a team really struggle with just kind of setting up the map mid to late game, which are all things that you can kind of like knock a support for in particular, because they should have a lot of contribution to that element of the game. So yeah, from that perspective, Mickey X isn't the best, but I do think that he's like really good at playing the game just individually.
Right, we're back for the second segment. We've got our new guest here. It's going to, of course, be Brokenshard. Now, Brokenshard, you spent some time in EU, but you also spent some time in NA. So have you ever felt like NA was really your home region?
You know, I gotta say, Thorin, after really thinking about it and looking at my bank account a couple of times, NA is definitely where I feel most at home. It's the land of, as you would put it, money, pizza, and white pussy.
No, the pizza was the white pussy, you idiot. That was the code word, wasn't it? Yeah, for the Koreans. Yeah, you are right. That's a good reference. Good reference. Basically, I like it whenever the guests reference old jokes of mine, basically. So if anyone wants to just be incredibly sycophantic, just go down that route. I appreciate it.
It's not narcissistic at all, is it?
not at all, no. Great reference. I should have actually just given you like, all right, I'll edit in a fucking standing ovation there. I'll get a dub track. I'll put that in there. Yeah, oh, brilliant one. Yeah, he's back. Right, so anyway, you're back for the second hour of Brokenshard. Entirely scheduled. This is exactly what I had planned for the show. And that's the story
definitely planned to keep me awake as long as possible tonight.
Yes, exactly. Right, so here's the question for you, Brokenshard. You sounded a bit down on the EU region a bit there. Like, you know, towards the end of the split, there was a bunch of teams that all had some flaws. G2 made it, but they had their own flaws. Like, let's just go ahead at the beginning and not just like delicately start to unwrap and pick apart this story. Let's just wade right in with both feet to start this part of the episode. You know, this is when all the fans are skipped to in the timestamp anyway. So let me just ask you this question. What do you think of the general level of playing NA and LCS right now?
I'm looking up synonyms for dumpster fire, hopelessness, very bad.
Okay.
I'm going to use.
I didn't ask you about the culture within Riot Games right now.
Come again?
It's better that you didn't hear that, right? The fans heard that one. It's okay. It doesn't matter. That one has to go by, right? So why then? Why is the level not that good? Because as we talk about the Gauntlet now for NA, there wasn't a load of close games. This wasn't some amazing Gauntlet. You know, this wasn't even one where I had a memorable run because every fucking round it was just someone getting dumpstered. So
it was a shit show. It was just a complete shit show. Like all three games were just terrible. And like in their own like special kind of way, all three games were just complete garbage. And it's like I can't pinpoint one reason why NA is so shit because every team is like in their own kind of special little trash pit. And it's like one team has a mentality issue. One team's players suck. One team's coaches don't know what they're fucking doing. One team is just downright garbage. So it's like, it depends. Like, where would you like to start? Would you like to start with just like Fox Clutch or like why it was bad?
Do we have to talk about Fox Clutch? Like, do we have to pretend? Can we pretend Clutch wasn't actually in the Gauntlet?
Exactly. Just give me a good reason why we shouldn't. I mean, essentially, the reason is that most people think this split Clutch game was shit, and there's a reason why they fired their own coach and why a number of the players probably won't be on the team. Basically, it was a failed project, right?
I mean, I heard of it differently. Like the coach left on his own accord, but sure. I think that there were a lot of problems with like the way that Clutch was built. Like a lot of those problems weren't really big in spring, and they just got worse over the year. Like, and when I say they got worse, Lyra got worse over the year, and then other players who were playing good didn't get better. And when I say other players, I mean solo.
So. Yeah, I there's an obvious joke I can make about you keeping keeping true to the Clutch statement that he left of his own accord. No, but
listen, Kelsey, a lot of coaches decide to just leave before the playoffs and the Gauntlet of their own accord. Maybe much like that guy who I don't even remember, that guy who used to be the Origin coach and was like, they can handle it without me, and just left, and then they did indeed handle it without him and even go to Worlds and go top 4. So maybe it was a happy story like that. Could have been.
Could very well be. I think that it got to a point where Clutch was really relying on like just showy performances from certain players, specifically Febivin. But even Febivin, I think obviously Febivin, his problems were broadcast on social media, on Reddit, on everything, where he just like really disliked being in NA at a point. He wasn't like feeling very happy, I think. And so you have him restricted to breakout performances on maybe one or two champions. And it's just not a very good position for Clutch to be in. I think that a lot of they didn't necessarily account for some of the shifts in meta well. I think that probably they were hit really hard early on in the season by the way it was changed, because obviously if you remember what they were like in spring, they relied a lot on like things like Ezreal stealing Baron as the game progressed, and just these sorts of situations that weren't possible. And then when the meta started to kind of swing maybe back a little bit into their court, they really struggled a lot. I think.
I hate to interrupt you because I'm going to pull a bit of a Thorin. It's like where he just kind of like interjects and gives his opinion. You know what I fucking hate? When teams do that shit where it's like, oh, they steal Baron with a fucking Ezreal ult, and fans think like, oh, that's the most insane play. Like, this guy is so good. He was able to randomly do like the 1 in 100 play by pressing one button. He's insane. That doesn't make a team good. That like, if you win games off stealing Barons or knocking teams away from an Elder Dragon to get it, Kelsey, doesn't make you a good team. It just means that the other team fucked up way too hard. But I think, isn't that like the story of NA? Like the other team kind of just like fucks up way harder than you do. And you're just like, well, I guess this is free.
I mean, it gets to a point watching these Gauntlet games where it felt a lot like they even kind of like I used to say that NA has this weird fascination with Dragon, where they force Dragons even when they don't have priority, when they have like bad backs, or when they're just kind of like, okay, everyone's here, let's fight. But it gets to a point where it's like when the Dragon isn't even there, they fight in Bot River. They're just kind of, it feels so weird. Like there are points where like Fox in the series could have just backed and picked up the stacked wave, and then they get an advantage off of that because obviously Clutch missed all of these minions. Or it's just so weird watching some of these games. Like it opened with an invade from Egrofox where they end up wasting time because Clutch just like gets their camp anyway, and then that just felt a lot like kind of how this series went, where neither of these teams were doing really well. It's just like Clutch at a point, like Fox forced enough that Clutch didn't have good answers, and Clutch didn't have like good enough players to kind of react, and that the series just kind of died at that point.
Like my will to live alongside it, watching Clutch, yeah, because I was actually casting this game because I did that whole like co-cast thing, and like besides the 20 million pauses that happened throughout the game, just the games were just so shit. I was really critical of Clutch's draft and the way that they prioritized their champions. I didn't like what they were doing at all. I know that there were a few people like Nick and Last Shadow said that he liked their draft, but I didn't understand why they were putting all their eggs in the solo basket with the Aatrox and Ash Tom picks. And I felt like the way that Fox, at least in a way, were drafting like Olaf, Alistair, Kai'Sa, playing for early aggression and like just letting Dardoch control the pace of the game was good. Was like it's good for their style, but it wasn't like they played it super well either. It was like Huni was legit solo killing solo in a tank v Aatrox matchup, and they were basically, I think 2 games in a row they cheesed level 1 and got something out of it.
This is where I kind of am on the side of LS, where it's like the draft is just objectively good. Like maybe Clutch are not a team that can play it out, but is there really a good composition that Clutch could play out really well against Echobox? I don't necessarily think there is. I think I didn't necessarily mind their drafts. I think that they, like the Ash Tom is actually pretty good. They can theoretically get prio with an Azir versus Syndra to a point. So they actually had a really good setup. Like in the first game, I thought their draft was good. So I don't know. If you look at like the drafts in isolation, I didn't think Clutch's drafts were like god awful. But it's just that the team itself is not going to be able to execute almost anything you give them well enough to beat Echo Fox. So
in itself, wouldn't that just make it a bad draft? Because that's always like a really interesting.
Well, then every draft that Echo Fox Clutch could do in the series would be a bad draft. And from that perspective, because I don't think that they'd be able to execute anything that you give them well. So,
right, moving on then. When Echo Fox and TSM played in the playoffs, it was a 5-game series, back and forth. What changed this time around?
NA kind of just happens.
I mean, honestly, I do think that naturally Echo Fox sort of play into what TSM wants, which I've described on previous episodes as like sort of these invades without good setups. TSM just collapse, and they went out that way. Echo Fox it was kind of weird because I felt like TSM sort of became Echo Fox in the series against Cloud9, where they would just start fights over nothing. And that would lose them the series. So yeah, it was like, to me, that aspect was really strange. But I don't know. I expected TSM to actually do a bit better against Echo Fox previously anyway. So
yeah.
Okay.
I also think that the way that TSM prioritized their picks as well was a little bit better. They utilized or maybe they either utilized them better or they played better in general, as Sven and VeXii playing a lot more like this best in the West bot lane that people are saying that they are. They had good performances at all 3 games, and they kind of gave Sven strong champions to utilize. They used Zyrakon first game and then Varus in both games. And Sven is someone that can easily use that. The Tom Kench, really good for VeXii. He's actually one of the few people that even in the what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a place where you go where just everyone just gets worse. I guess the NALCS. Even in the NALCS, he's using Tom Kench well, and I think the way that TSM planned out their game plans was good, and at the same time as well, Echo Fox kind of played like dog shit a lot. They just got worse a day later.
Right. Obviously, people will have seen, even if, yes, we have gone away from that really wacky meta, you can absolutely still play things that can carry in the top lane. I mean, I think in the ULCS Gauntlet, Alfari played a game of Swain. Obviously, in this series, Hauntzer was playing Aatrox. What do you think of putting Huni on, what was it, Cho'Gath and Rumble, I think it was? Obviously, in Echo Fox, you're always going to have the Huni discussion. Did they give him? Are these actually things he could have played effectively? Did he play effectively? Where would you come down on this?
I think top lane pool is a weird thing to talk about, and I guess we'll be talking a little bit more meta-ish about why tanks are so OP is because of sustain, and sustain is broken, and then the only way to counter sustain is either more sustain. If you can't one shot someone who basically just revolves around taking a trade and then healing it back, you have to one-shot him. And if you can't one-shot a tank, you're going to need either better sustain of your own or just constant push and trade, which is why Urgot works, which is why in a way Swain can work, and then also in a way why Aatrox can work. I'd say that putting Huni on those champions isn't necessarily a thing of can he be effective? It's these are the pressure top lanes of the meta. Cho and Ornn have very strong push power. Cho specifically in level 1 to 2, his autos are really disgusting in the trade, and Cho would be the closest thing to a tank carry that there is because of the way that it plays. And Huni played a lot of Cho in Korea as well when he was on SKT, and so I wouldn't say that he necessarily played those bad, but it's maybe they could have picked something better earlier into the Aatrox. Camille is a sort of okay matchup, and it could work. But it didn't seem like Huni was going to be playing too many carries, though.
Fiora may be a bit better, but it requires more jungle pressure. I mean, it's just there's not like a lot of good answers to Aatrox in lane.
Yeah,
so,
you said that earlier.
Yeah, and as it was when he was winning lane as Ornn versus Aatrox.
Yeah,
so.
he was winning. He was winning. Like that is something to consider. Like he was winning losing matchups. Even though, but the thing is, I think that a big thing was giving Haunter like this almost automatic free win champion shouldn't have happened, because like imagine if that champion was either gone or Huni had it. Like, let's say maybe they don't want to play her on top. So what if they just got rid of Aatrox? Wouldn't then just like automatically Huni would just start winning those matchups? Because like what's Haunter going to play? Like traditionally Haunter plays stuff like, I mean he could play Ornn as well. He'll play like Gnar most likely, right? If not for the Aatrox, I'd assume.
Yeah, he played Ornn in the third game when they banned Aatrox. So.
Yeah, so he just default to Ornn, and then in that situation, like in a tank v tank matchup, either they'll go neutral, and since Huni's a better player than Haunter, it'd be better. But in this series in particular, on the Ornn pick, I wouldn't say it's the pick and the more Huni played it, because if you take a look at how many times he died just so far ahead of his team, it was like I think 4 or 5 times where he was just like, all right, Echo Fox are gone, and Huni's dead. Just like walked up, got picked off, or pulled in, or something, or was just in a place where he shouldn't have been. And it seemed like that isn't like a laning thing. That's more like he's just like inting it outside of lane.
I think theoretically, the Ornn into Aatrox kind of makes sense, because I think that if you know how TSM kind of want to play is just like they like to group and force 5v5s. If Fox want to answer that, like Aatrox sort of requires sort of precise flanks and setups to actually teamfight effectively. I kind of prefer Aatrox in a side lane overall. So a tank like Ornn could be a good answer theoretically if you're approaching it from that angle and you expect Huni to win. Anyway, I don't think Haunter's Aatrox was super good.
No.
So it didn't immediately jump out to me as something that you have to deny or ban anyway in this particular scenario. So,
I think the champion is just stupid. It's like it's too forgiving, and I think when Haunter faltered is like when teams were being able to take advantage of him not being super good. And when your best answer is to put Huni on Ornn, isn't that like inherently just like a bad idea, a bad response altogether?
I think like maybe the better answers to Aatrox are actually more jungle or global related, which we can talk about a bit more in the next series. But it's just so it's not even like a laning thing. It's just where Aatrox can be countered. I think is not specifically in lane. Like obviously Aatrox is pretty much like Aatrox is really, really strong because he's probably just going to win lane matchups and you can do stuff on the other side of the map. And then once he gets 6, even if he gets ganked, like he can get a free death, etc. So I think there are ways to deal with it. They didn't necessarily draft for that, I felt. But I don't necessarily think, like, based on the performances we've seen of Haunter's Aatrox, that you come in thinking, oh, how do we deal with this Haunter Aatrox? Like, this is so difficult. I honestly felt like Fox hurt themselves more in this series with their gameplay and the way that they were approaching, like, fights that they shouldn't have taken, things like that, than it was draft related.
And I don't think it's draft related, but I always usually start with draft when I'm looking at it. It was just bad play all around by Fox.
Okay, what has your thoughts been on DeMonte? So this is obviously the individual they brought in to replace Phoenix, and in theory this is a rookie, this is someone getting his first big chance. Now we've seen him in the playoffs, we've seen him in this particular matchup now in the Gauntlet. What's your take on him?
When it comes to NA mids, he's definitely top 3. I wouldn't say DeMonte is bad per se. I think he's still got a long way to go in terms of, like, as a player and confidence in lane matchups that he definitely can win. If I'm thinking back, like, to the playoff match that they had against TSM, DeMonte had some moments in those games where he was just, like, really taking it to Bjergsen and doing super well. I think right now I wouldn't put him as a top mid, but he's the closest thing to, like, a breakout talent that NA is going to have, and there's definitely some potential there for him to be one of the better mids in NA, and not necessarily just an NA mid, but like actual, like compared to the other mid laners in NA, including the imports.
I don't necessarily know if this is accurate, but based on the amount of seasons and footage we've seen of Phoenix, like Ultric, Adrian, these players, you kind of get the feeling that what you see from them is what you get, and the way they play is kind of rigid. It's like very specific. They have a few champions that they'll do well on. They won't necessarily always do that well if they're outside of their comfort zone. So they probably felt like they had to change. They had to invest in some players that they didn't necessarily think would be immediately better than these players right now, but could be. And Damonte was someone that they'd already been kind of working into the roster. They, like, obviously, you had Lost probably was something that was in the works for a while, since, you know, you have the, like, members of the staff who have kept an eye on the Oceanic scene. And then, like, obviously Smoothie is a really good pickup. So
it was, like, I think the big pickup for them, like, more so than anything, that allowed the other things to happen.
But obviously, like, if you're going for Lost, and maybe they thought Lost was absolutely the best ADC option, then you can't have Phoenix anymore. You already have Damonte kind of working onto the roster. Like, I think a lot of people think that Lost is probably the main motivation for making Damonte more permanent. It feels way more like a natural kind of transition where, okay, we know what Phoenix is like as a player. At a point, Dardoch's pathing almost becomes super telegraphed because he comes mid to help, like, with 2v1 and give Phoenix an advantage he can work with, like, at level 3 almost consistently. So what change can we make that will give our team maybe more variation? And so I felt like Damonte made sense. They were already working him in. They were already giving him playtime as far back as spring. So yeah, I mean, I don't think the decision is bad. I think that Damonte is someone who should be given some LCS games, and I'd like to see if he can grow as a player and do better. So, yeah.
Okay.
I also think, like, some of the changes that Echo Fox made, at least if you think about, like, the Phoenix Altec Adrian compared to Damonte Lost Smoothie, is that they have a lot more playmaking potential around the map with these three new players. Mm-hmm. It's like Damonte, I think, can be a Phoenix, but Phoenix can never be the one player to kind of take, like, a backseat role in the game, whereas Damonte definitely can, which frees up Dardoch to kind of have opportunities on the map. Adrian isn't, like, I would say, like, the most playmaking support, and Altec isn't the most dominant player in the game, so it's like it limits them to kind of having to play around Huni in mid lane. So they're kind of just, like, opening up their options for different styles of gameplay. And we were talking a little bit about how, like, teams are one-dimensional, and maybe Echo Fox are failing at it now. But if we're thinking about, like, the way that NA as a league is structured now, and since it's a franchise, everything is more long-term. They're definitely taking the steps to make sure that they have success, or at least a road to success coming into the future. Like, Lost, while not exceptional, is a very good player. Damonte, while not exceptional, is a very good player, and Smoothie maybe is one of the better supports in NA, maybe not necessarily as a laner, but he's always been strong on engages and playmaking, which frees up Dardoch to be able to play other stuff, like the Sinzao pick, or maybe a Kindred pick, or maybe carries rather than engage tanks. So it's like it's all about a now versus then. So now we've seen what happens now, where Echo Fox are kind of, like, good, and they also have, like, days where they're not so good, but maybe a year down the line, we'd have to just look at it again and see where they come. Like, after they've developed these players and different types of styles that they can use out of it.
And obviously, I feel personally, it's still too early to say that C9's investment, like, definitely paid off, because we want to see, like, more time with the players that they're bringing up. But I think a lot of people will have that feeling. And so this is definitely a direction, even if Fox don't make Worlds, that they probably are happy that they took, you know, that if they're thinking long-term about, we can build a roster from these pieces better, than they look at a team like Cloud9 that has, like, the Golden Glue and the Blabber and Zazel and stuff like this, and is going to Worlds, and people are arguing look better than they ever did. They probably think that they made a good decision, even if they're not going to Worlds. So
in that world then, where you're trying to keep the remnants of this roster, presumably you want to keep Dardoch, okay, maybe you want to keep these two semi-rookies as well and put them in. Does that mean that the transition next is a Huni-less Echo Fox? Time to move away from Huni?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it kind of depends on your philosophy. I think that some people might see it as like Huni is the teacher of the team, so they want to stick with Huni a bit later. Some people might think that, okay, yeah, we need a top laner with more flexibility to go with this as well and make this as a super long-term problem where everyone, super long-term roster where everyone kind of like learns from each other and they build their play style around each other. So I guess it depends on what philosophy they kind of have.
I'm with Kelsey on that one. It depends, like, what do they want out of a top laner? If they're finding like trying to emulate the same philosophy they had on the other players, and they're bringing it to the top lane, then yeah, they'll probably. I don't know if they'll bring in necessarily a rookie. They might, but who would they invest in? I guess they get to kind of pick of the mill because it is an import slot. They don't necessarily have to fill it, but ideally, like, who would they get if NA player? There isn't really much around, unless you're taking Licorice out of Cloud9, and that's definitely not going to happen ever. Maybe a more stable import top laner could happen. Someone like a Someday, or I wouldn't say an Impact, since Impact necessarily is only on tanks. But yeah, I think if it would make sense for Echo Fox, that would be the next step. I would never, ever, ever replace Dardoch. Like, Echo Fox need to do whatever they can to hold on to him. He's improved, maybe not necessarily as an individual players, but like as a teammate and like as a member of a team in ways that are just like crazy. He's like one of the perfect players to have on your team because he's still, despite the NA lifestyle, is hungry to improve and motivated as a player, which is huge. Which means that he's always going to be like on top of his game, and he's also doesn't take an import slot. And it kind of sucks that when we talk about NA, we have to talk about import slots, but it's like kind of like a reality of the situation where it's like if you're a valuable player and you don't take an import slot, you are just the most important piece in roster puzzles.
Speaking of which, TSM gets to cheat and just use Bjergsen as an NA resident.
Yeah.
So what about this then? So Team TSM, obviously, when they actually played against Cloud9 in the semi-finals of the LCS, close series. Everyone remembers the whole storyline with Svenskeren and Golden Glue being subbed in to bring Cloud9 back for the last two games. This time around, pretty clean series. Looked good for C9. What went wrong for TSM? Why wasn't TSM more competitive here?
Hanser's Aatrox is a big thing. Like so Licorice. I had the pleasure of working with him in 2017 on United, and this, even as a challenger player, he was always very good at understanding and learning lane matchups and abusing matchups well, or where it's like even if there's a strong champion there, he's going to take advantages from it. So they were basically like picking into Licorice's strengths every time. He got the Aatrox in game one, and he kind of went big with it, and that's really good for them. That's huge for the way that they're trying to play, and obviously like using Blabber as well to facilitate stronger leads. And then this Hecarim pick, well, I'm not sure if it's a counter to Aatrox in the sense it worked for TSM, and they kind of just like TSM tried to play the same way they did against Echo Fox against C9, and when it didn't work necessarily, they weren't picking up leads, they kind of just collapsed and they didn't really know how to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, I think it's so weird because TSM behaved in this game not necessarily strangely, but like TSM have a habit of picking themselves compositions that don't necessarily have like super duper clear early game objectives, and they're fine playing like kind of losing jungle matchups and stuff. And sometimes TSM made kind of smart plays, but they were always around the lanes in this series. Like the first game, I remember, okay, so, you know, Bjergsen is going bot, right? Is TPing bot off of the fact that he got a back advantage early on in lane. And then C9 see this, and they're immediately like invading topside. So it was interesting because almost every play TSM played, stayed around the lanes. C9 like countered with like a play around the jungle on the other side of the map. And I think they were just better off at trading sides in these scenarios. TSM also seemed to be a little bit like the games just kind of didn't go the way that they were planning because they draft Aatrox. Okay, we have a super strong top lane pick, right? And he should win lane, so we'll play to this side. But then you have your Xayah Rakan getting solo kills in the bot side, and you don't do anything off of this pressure, and in fact, like end up losing Inferno because of kind of like poor reaction to the way that the game and the dynamic is shifting. Also, I think that Cloud9's answers to Aatrox weren't purely like lane 1v1, but I do think the fact that they were way more prepared for the Aatrox and could play around that more intelligently, like they had not just the Nocturne in the first game, but they also came to bat with like more globals, like they had the Talia and the Rise. And so I think that Aatrox is kind of difficult or trickier to execute in a teamfight scenario than he is to side lane. So when there was this scenario where it felt like you had to ban Aatrox, Nocturne, and Talia literally every red side game, if it happened such that like Aatrox and one of the other two would go through, I would say the other two were higher prio because you could like kind of answer Aatrox by 2v1ing mid to late. So I think that C9 sort of took that philosophy much better. They had ways to they used Hecarim almost as a tool to zone or kite the Aatrox as well in teamfights. So for me, like it just felt like C9 had a better plan, and maybe they utilized kind of what TSM were doing in the Echo Fox series to come to the game with an idea of how they wanted to execute. So.
It's also like what you were talking about, how using like junglers to influence the Aatrox lane. Like you said, the Nocturne was good, the Talia was good, but also the Camille, which is like a Blabber special. He was just so good at he's like so good at like abusing like early game, and it's a really good champion for doing that. So it's like they paired it with Aatrox in this situation to get advantages, but like they could easily just use it. And it's also the way that C9 uses their jungler to be a playmaker, and TSM have almost traditionally never used their jungler to be a playmaker. They're just like, no. You do not make plays, you camp lanes. And it kind of shows like Sion, like they pick Zac, Trundle, Sejuani in their games, and they don't use like Grigney as like an extension of their gameplay, and more uses it as a prop for their laners, which I don't think is like philosophically correct for the jungle role.
Loco Dogo said something interesting when they were doing these kind of live casts with LS. He said that like from his experience on TSM, he suspected that Grig had the last say in basically any sort of plan or thing like this. And to me, that just suggests that, like...
I love the way they're going with like the Stockholm syndrome and angle of like, no, he wanted to do it.
But to go back to like one of Thorin's favorite shticks is it's like, oh yeah, he wants to do it. It's like, well, if he has the last say, is he going to be the last guy who says, yeah, you're like Bjergsen, Sven, Mithy, you're all fucking wrong. Like I'm doing it my way. It takes like a young guy with a lot of guts to do something like that. Which is why
I'm so certain Grig was like, yeah, I'd like to get butt fucked in the jungle matchup. That's exactly what I like to do. I'd like Blabber to shove it so far up my fucking ass. I guess he was just like, I don't think he was brainwashed into thinking that way, but like on like a philosophical level, he's like, this is like what's expected of me. Like, am I going to be the playmaker when I have Sven Mithy, Bjergsen, and Hanser? And I think like that shock factor is preventing junglers that would otherwise perform well, like Blabber coming into C9. The environment and philosophy is a little bit better. It's like I've got Zazel, I've got Licorice, and like there's Jensen in the mid lane, but he's getting subbed out, so he's like, okay, Jensen is super good, but it's like I have my ability to be an individual and have my say in how I want to play the game. Whereas on TSM, it's all very rigid and really like robotic.
I feel like this is why I was kind of like optimistic about Mike Young, because he came into Phoenix 1, for example, telling like established players like Ryu, etc., that we're going to play the game this way, and he took like shot calling responsibilities as a rookie. But I don't necessarily always think that he was smart about the game, right? And I think that ended up being a bigger problem on TSM where they wouldn't just kind of go along with the jungler. So he probably lost a lot of confidence at a crucial juncture that way, rather than being like the super cocky guy who could stand up to like the likes of Bjergsen and say, no, we're going to do this my way now. So
I've always like I there was a Yamato Cannon tweet that I think resonated well with like the way I see the game, is that like if there is no such thing as high tempo and low tempo jungling, there is just jungling. And if you're not doing it like high tempo and looking for opportunities on the map, that you're not really jungling, you're just being passive. And jungle has always been like, I guess next to support, or even in some cases mid lane, jungle has over the last eight years of League of Legends of pro play has always been the role with the most playmaking potential. Maybe not the highest carry potential, but definitely the most playmaking potential. And I think philosophically there's a huge problem on the way that TSM utilizes junglers, in the sense that they don't use the maximum playmaking potential out of the junglers. Not even just rookies, like using Greg as a rookie who has a lot of mechanical skill. And when he was playing with Damonte on Delta Fox back in 2017, they were basically kind of like always playing around each other and just like hard ganking mid, kind of like the way that Dardoch was playing around Phoenix, where he would like look to get advantages. And I was a bit optimistic when they brought Greg on, like maybe he'd do that, but he kind of just like devolved into this like supportive player 90% of the time. It's really weird the way that they phrased it with like high tempo versus low tempo jungling, whereas I feel like you have tempo if you clear faster, basically. Like it's down to like champion clear speeds, whether or not you're utilizing the fact that you have a higher tempo jungle pick. I mean, it's not really they want me to play high tempo and low. Like it's such a weird way to put it. It makes me just think that Mike Young fundamentally doesn't understand what that means. Maybe he means something else when he says high tempo.
Yeah, he probably just meant like my understanding
versus reactive. Maybe.
My understanding is he probably meant he wanted to play like jungles that clear fast, like Nidalee and Olaf and stuff like this, but they wanted him to play like Sejuani and stuff, which isn't going to clear as fast. Like that's kind of how I read it, which is a super simple thing, and he just phrased it really weird. So, yeah. I of course, like I've said a lot about TSM and their jungle situation. It's always a fun subject to talk about. I published like a really big article on all of their world's performances and all of their different junglers.
Remember the title?
Oh gosh, I did it for HTC, Esports, TSM, Jungle. Here we go. Team Solo Mid's mid jungle problem. There you go.
It's one of those. That was during the peak of your great titles. Yes.
Yeah.
Here's the thing.
I mean, you say
that's
that
a great working
because
title.
my titles have always been bad. Yeah,
exactly. So. As a draft, that's a fucking brilliant title. You'll never forget what it is, but it doesn't roll off the tongue so hard. But what about this then? Right, this will sound like a massive softball question, but I mean it not necessarily just in this instance, but as like a trend. If say this is possible, is this where if you're TSM, you just contact Meteos now and say, listen, I don't know how much longer you want to play for, but you know what? We've got a really good core roster. Just play with us for a year, see what happens. Like we give you like a lot of autonomy, what you do as a jungler. Would you go a route like this? Would you try again with a rookie and hope you can mold them into the right player? What would you do if you were the TSM general manager? But to both of you.
I feel like so there are, I mean, as like obviously like Kelsey is in a way is also like has experience when it comes to coaching. When you're kind of like brought onto an already established team, kind of like as a new staff member or a staff member there are already going to be certain systems and philosophies in place that have always been there, have been developed to the point where they're like almost ingrained. And I think that's a huge thing with TSM, is that there is a philosophy in there that is just inherently flawed, that just has for the last couple of years just doesn't work long term. And I think besides getting a new player or getting a new jungler or whatever, whether he be a rookie or an established player, that philosophy needs to change. Now, I know Kelsey said something about like it takes like a special rookie to be able to stand up to people like Bjergsen, or Sven Mithi. So how about someone who's actually won stuff or has actually gone far in worlds like Meteos? So I wouldn't say it's like Meteos the player is going to change his philosophy, but actually bringing on Meteos, someone who can dictate a little bit more about like how he wants to play the jungle, might be a good step forward into changing that ingrained philosophy that exists on TSM.
I think so. For me, it's interesting because at the same time, I feel like if it is kind of a top-down philosophy, which I think it is, like I looked at it, obviously the game has developed so much so that the way that they played in, season 2, season 3, when Reginald was the mid laner, like may not have been the same way they'd play if they'd known a bit more, right? But it feels like they kind of haven't evolved from that position. So it's just like kind of like an org ingrained philosophy about how the jungle is almost. So I feel like you have to do something more drastic than bringing on another jungler. Like bringing in another jungler to me isn't necessarily going to fix everything, because it could be to the point where Meteos ends up in another 100 Thieves situation where his disagreement leads to like him moving, right, rather than the team changing. So I think that this is obviously not against Bjergsen, but I would almost just like blow it up, just completely blow it up and start from scratch, come up with new ideas, new philosophies completely. And just Bjergsen probably will have success in another setting as well. Like the org can probably have success if they secure like the kinds of talents they want. Like I do think TSM is an organization that can continue rebuilding and have success. But like they pick a different cornerstone player, like I think that they can still do well in an NA setting. But what they have now, like something big has to change for this team to change the way that they're playing. So
yeah, I guess maybe just getting Meteos wouldn't be enough and just like blowing everything up and starting from scratch. It's like almost as if like, I'm going to sound like a complete and total fucking nerd when I say this. It's like these ingrained philosophies are like the old gods, and TSM is like Azeroth, where it's like they've been infected and they're like so ingrained in it, and the only way to do that is to just blow the planet up and start from scratch somewhere, which could make sense. But like, would you keep anyone from the, obviously when you say blow it up, you're basically meaning remove Bjergsen from the equation, because like the most common denominator is always Bjergsen. Like Bjergsen can be, and he is a fantastic player, and it has nothing to do with him as a player, but it's more just like the setting just doesn't exist. And if you think about it, you mentioned like, from the beginning, like who was the very first jungler for TSM? Like who was the guy who was making all their success? Was the odd one. And what kind of jungler was the odd one? Was supportive beta
People
jungler.
forget this aspect, because here's what's funny. They always reference like, Kelsey really overblew that storyline. It was just Santorin, and Amazing wasn't entirely like that, because obviously when Amazing first came, he played like Kha'Zix or whatever, But like, first of all, people completely forget the odd one, which is like, I remember at season 3 Worlds, there was that thread where it was like the Korean casters even called the odd one some mad shit like that he called, like they had some like joke that he calls Reginald the president, and he's just like his fucking bodyguard.
The general.
No, this was a joke about how Reginald treated him, as though like he was like the summoner spell of Reginald. He just 24/7 had to keep Reginald alive in lane, and like that's all his job was. Because if you remember season 3 Worlds, it's basically how TSM played. It was like Reginald got to look slightly good while they lost every single game. Almost, not entirely, that's hyperbole, but you know what I mean. Like all the games against SK Telecom, OMG, they lost them all. So like, that actually was basically, funnily enough, the reason why I bring that up is because that's actually a healthy relationship. The odd one wanted to play like that. Reginald wanted him to play like that. Perfect. That's fine when two people want to play like that and have success. That's the ideal scenario. The question is, we've already tried to root out, like, what's the flaw in the org, or which player is it? That's why I kind of feel like Kelsey's right. Like, you just got to blow it up, and that probably means no more Bjergsen, because I would put it this way. If Bjergsen really doesn't believe that they're doing this to junglers, I'd ask him this one question. You are the star player, franchise, face of TSM. At this point, coming on half a decade, you clearly have the ear of the ownership. How are you never able to communicate what apparently is your totally different philosophy on the jungle to the fucking owner whose position you now play? Like, there's clearly a disconnect here, mate. Like, either you can't get through or you yourself don't know what you're talking about. It's one of the two.
I also want to mention another common denominator. So Reginald was the original mid laner, and that was the original way that they played the game.
Sure.
And when Bjergsen came on, people also forget that they still had the odd one. And it was like, if you're going to be playing for mid lane, you may as well have your mid laner be an actual good player. But when Bjergsen came on to TSM, he isn't like, he's definitely changed as a person over the last several years. He's become more confident, more assertive in how he wants to play the game, and he's learned. But when he first came on, he was some just shy, skinny little Danish kid. You know, he was young and he didn't really understand. So who is he going to turn to for mentorship? Reginald, who has always kind of just been there to kind of like guide TSM, even as an owner. Reginald, who has had to literally step in as a coach situations because there were problems internally. Reginald. So while Bjergsen might be a common denominator, Reginald is also a common denominator. And it's almost as if, like, do you have to essentially remove Andy from the team in order for them to get their own philosophies? Because these philosophies date back to Season 2 era TSM. And that's kind of like how Bjergsen was raised up as a mid laner, kind of under Reginald's tutelage and under the same ingrained philosophies that old era TSM had. And maybe it might be too late for Bjergsen now, or maybe it's not. But I actually think that they either have to remove one or both of Reginald and Bjergsen to kind of just like start from scratch and just like get a nice blank piece of paper. And I don't say fire. Listen, I'm not saying fire Reginald. I'm saying just
Brokenshard.
Yeah.
I love me some hypotheticals. You know that. I love going into all the ones. But I'm just going to go ahead and say on a practical level, I don't think TSM will be removing both Reginald and Bjergsen from the equation. Yeah. I just feel as though that might not be coming down the pipeline.
It's not necessarily remove them from fire Reginald, but I'm just like saying have him be in a position where he can't influence the team's philosophies. That's what I mean by remove Reginald, by the way, just to clarify.
I mean, he's tried to do that more and more, I feel. Like, Reginald has tried to do that more and more. He just doesn't know how to respond to situations where things go really bad without stepping in. And I think, like, it feels like he tried. I obviously don't know anything about what TSM are specifically doing behind the scenes, but it feels like this year he's done it. At least there have been fewer statements about it, you know. Maybe that's just like a new change in PR, as we're not going to tell you what's going on. But it feels kind of like he's taken a step back. Like, they brought in two people in leadership positions that they felt like Reginald wouldn't have to step in. Like, you had Mithy, you have allegedly Song was supposed to be like a strong, opinionated coach. So it feels like Reginald stepped back, but obviously, like, we still have Bjergsen with the sort of mentality. I would say one thing that's sort of different from Reginald and Bjergsen is if you watched like the Season 2 era games, there was almost this joke that Reginald would always be waiting by the second blue buff, right? He would always be like with Odd One kind of, whereas I feel like there is, at least to an extent, somewhat of a more fundamental difference in idea on how they want to play. And part of that is just like understanding of like how much you lose when you lose a wave, et cetera, that's developed over the years. It's just that like we see much less of a connection between Bjergsen wanting to play around the jungle than even Reginald had. So I do think that there is like there can be something said for just changing mid laner and seeing what happens from there, and seeing if like Bjergsen finds more success in a different environment and TSM as an org finds more success with a different mid laner. So,
you know, another angle as well that I've always found very weird about the TSM situation is that if you ever hear the way they talk, you'd never know they were a team that was ever coached by anyone. Like when they had Loco, okay, Loco had a big personality, but like, I don't really necessarily know that he was in like full control of that team. Sounds as though he wasn't necessarily, as though he was more of like a mixture of an analyst and the person who decides the draft, basically. Then you look at when they had Path, they themselves were the idiots that kept playing that angle of like, you know, he wasn't even supposed to be the coach. Why are you telling me that, you idiot? You've hired him as that fucking job and kept him on it for 2 years. Like, are you mentally ill? Which is it? Is he your coach or not? You chose that. Like, it's not like you were like, oh, well, It's not like fucking, what's that game called? Musical chairs, and there was like no chair left or whatever. Like, and then now you come to Song. The whole point, like what Kelsey alluded to, is the storyline here was right. Here's a Korean coach with Korean background. He's just coached the Immortals team. That team's broken up. We need a proper coach, someone who really is going to do the job. We bring him in, and then every interview you've ever seen that brings up these topics because it's the same problems again and again. Jungler, is Bjergsen playing the right way? The players talk as though they decide half the shit in the team, like as though they figure it out themselves. It's bizarre because I would have thought a top level org like TSM would be a team like, okay, think about Cloud9. People actually have finally picked up on my narrative, which is why is Reaper just allowed 1 million seasons with most of the best players and never winning the title? I don't know why. I'd assume he just has a wicked relationship with Jack, but at least in his case, he gets some of the credit or the blame when C9 wins or loses. People just act as though there isn't even a coach in TSM half the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that also another philosophy or mentality on that team, and this is something that is kind of just like brought on by Bjergsen, is that like the position of coach in TSM has always been a replaceable position, but the position of mid lane has never been a replaceable position. And it has always been like, as a coach, like if I were to go onto TSM, hypothetically, it's like just starting to just kind of like put myself into position, or to put like ideals or philosophies in place there. If there is even a slight disagreement and it's like the coach doesn't get like the say in that situation, then he'll lose credibility, and then it's always just going to be an uphill battle from there. So I almost feel like if you're going to blow it up, then you're going to need to bring in some coach and make sure that his position is not a replaceable position, and the players know that this guy is not going away, so you better listen to him or you can go away. But yes. I don't realistically think that can be said in TSM's current situation. But I think that's like the problem that Loco must have faced, Parth must have faced, Song must have faced, or literally any coach that would come onto TSM who may have had like some kind of strong opinion that differed from the way that the players wanted to play.
That's the thing that I think is like really the most interesting for me about this recent split of NA, is that we're seeing halfway through the season, like half of the teams decided to replace their coach. And that could be because it was just after roster lock and they couldn't change other positions. Sure. But also the idea that, okay, something is wrong, we're changing the coach means either NA is an environment where the coaches like maybe aren't good enough, or it's just an environment where orgs are not necessarily giving authority to the coaches. It could obviously be a mix of both, but I see this as kind of an interesting thing, that it doesn't just seem, and obviously TSM has always sort of been the org that other teams look at in the region as well, and TSM has always kind of been the one where you replace the coach, you replace like everyone except for your cornerstone player. And I feel like a lot of orgs have maybe sort of followed in that lead. So it'll be interesting to see what the effect of this split has been, with like C9 kind of coming back from the brink and them always being an org that's sort of like had faith in Rebirth, you know. And then TSM not making worlds. So it'll be really, really interesting to see if there's just like a general regional mentality about coaching in NA. So.
Yeah, I think it's just like a worldwide thing as well. Like people misunderstand like a coach's role, but I also think that like a coach's role isn't so easily defined as it is like a player. Of like when you get a player, it's like, oh, this player plays mid lane, this player plays top lane, and it's like this coach does X and Y, and like every person is different, everyone has their own style or take on it. But at the end of the day, a coach is someone who needs to lead a team. And if you're someone, it's like being a leader of a country. If like the second that someone doesn't like what you're doing or it doesn't fully agree with it, he can just like make a coup and remove you from power, then what point is there in putting someone in a position of leadership, you know?
And at the same time, I'm not condoning that, like, if your coach sucks, don't fire him. Like,
of
obviously.
course, yeah. But I feel like people
like,
are too
which is why I'm saying, like, I do think there's a mix, right, where it's really difficult for a coach to get authority, but it's also like a lot of coaches just aren't very good, and you have to kind of almost affirmative action the coaches, because like give them a place to a higher starting point where they have to like kind of catch up to their position.
It's basically like what happened with coaches in the first place, where the whole argument that people like TSM had as to why they didn't get a coach is because there were no good coaches. But it's like, well, you have to create the good coaches by having coaches. And then once you have a set of coaches and an economy of coaches, if you are now the best org, hopefully you can now hire the best coach in the coaching pool, you know, and gradually it works its way on. So yeah, I would agree. I mean, not necessarily the least controversial fucking way to phrase it with the affirmative action route there. So I will personally avoid that term. But yes, I do think that just going ahead and giving all coaches some extra degree of sort of power or responsibility would be good, in as much as some of them would then show themselves to be much better coaches, set themselves apart, and you'd also create an environment where even if this guy ends up being bad when we give him that power and we have to fire him, the next coach that comes in who might end up being good has that power already. And, you know, it's expected from the player. He can bench me. He can do this. I have to say, I'm going to go ahead and say this. What I don't necessarily buy, and I could hear the skepticism a little bit from Kelsey there. I don't necessarily buy that, like, Cloud9 has cracked the code and, you know, it's having all these subs and swapping them in and out. Like, you know, I think some of that might have just been the fact that they won so many games. People kind of have romanticized that because it sounds like an awesome storyline. But I will say, bearing in mind TSM was a team where, actually, I think it was like over a year ago, I remember Reginald saying, we're going to have subs for every position. Maybe he said it in my interview in the off-season. We're going to have subs for every position, and you're really going to have to compete for that. I think at this point in time, that probably should be an option for TSM. There should at least be a world in which the Cloud9 example of where objectively it's very hard to make any case that Golden Glue is better than Jensen. But you can certainly make a good case that with a certain comp and with a certain set of players, it might work better in this one game to run Golden Glue than to run Jensen. I think actually Cloud9 probably could make a compelling case for times that made sense. There should at least be that option in TSM, not least because then we could actually start to kind of like test the fault of the wire, like where is the wire got its fault in it, you know, by doing this approach and see, is it Bjergsen in the Sarah? Is it Bjergsen only when he's with this type of a player? Can we put a different mid laner in that works with a jungler that is playing more support? You know, I think that at least to have that option would be cool for TSM, because you don't want to jettison all the talent and just have to get new talent all over. But for some reason, bizarrely, this season they didn't do that, even though they had the franchise and opportunity to do so, seemingly.
I think it's obviously, like, as you brought up, like C9 cracked the code or whatever. It's, I think for so long the bar has been beating TSM that C9 suddenly beat TSM and they realized, oh well, C9 actually didn't perform better than they have. You know, like C9 are still kind of the second or third best team in NA, right? They're not doing like significantly better than they were before, but they have kind of done something where they are freely subbing in players, and I feel like that hasn't really been done that well in NA before, because as we've been talking about, like the authority comes from the players. So yes. Players are obviously not going to be able to say, oh, except for in some extreme cases where players actually do say, I'm subbing myself out because I suck or because the meta's bad, reckless. They're like, you very rarely get it because you don't have coaches with enough power to say, but he's playing this game, and have the orgs then back them up. So I think that is something that C9 have done well, like regardless of whether or not you think Reaper is like the world's God's gift to coaching or whatever, the fact that they give him the authority to do that and they work on the team with that mentality allows them to have this sort of structure in place.
Yeah, I think it's less about the subs and more about like the way that they utilize Reaper as a coach. It's like everyone's kind of like bought into like whatever Reaper is selling, and like even though it might not be the highest quality that there is, it's something that all the team, the staff, the players are doing something together in the sense where it's like even if they're fucking up or doing something wrong, at least they're united on that front, and so that like if they're doing it all united and it doesn't work, they can quickly go back to the drawing board and say, okay, this doesn't work, let's move on to something else. And that just makes developing, learning, and improving as a team a lot quicker when you kind of know that the problem was a direction. Whereas on TSM side, like what you said, they kind of have to test the wire. At this point, it's like troubleshooting. Either they blow it up or they troubleshoot, where they just really have to kind of go a little bit crazy and really test the waters with different possibilities. But that's none of that is going to work if they keep the same philosophy that they have towards like how they deal with coaches and how they deal with the direction and leadership on the team.
Sure. Like, I have to say, the narrative that drove me fucking mad was when Team Liquid won the NALCS. And so since all the hype on Reddit for a few days was like, wow, like, now Doublelift has as many titles as Bjergsen. Oh, Team Liquid's won all these titles, when they used to be a joke. It's like it was like the concrescence of fucking narratives just building and building until it just exploded like some fucked up blister of pus narrative all over us. So that then people actually were riding the fucking circle jerk hype train of TSM should have kept Bjergsen and Doublelift.
No, please don't. You're triggering me.
What, during Worlds Season 7, every TSM fan was like, kick them both, or one of them, just please get rid of this lineup. It's like, now we're going to walk that all the way back to like, fuck, winning LCS was still good. We should just go back to the old lineup. It's like, that's why I did that meme where it was like, this lineup had run its course. I believe we gave it as much, it only had the 3 splits, the fucking 2 world championships, an MSI along the way. Like, it kind of had its chance to succeed, that lineup, Now, listen, there's a world in which, maybe you could have gotten a different support or something. I still don't feel like fundamentally you were going to change that much about that squad. Like, I think that was fair enough from TSM. And plus, come on, why are we doing this as well? Like, you can definitely criticise the way they coached the team, the way they subbed in the jungler, the way they actually played the fucking games. But on paper, the lineup did look pretty fucking amazing when they brought in Sven and Mithy. And,
absolutely.
Come on, we can't pretend like that. We're going to retcon that was shit. Like, on the off-season, the jungle part you can criticise. Everything else, the lineup looked fucking good. I thought this looked like it was going to be a team that was even better than the last one. So I'll take my L on that one. We've got to all agree to take the fucking L on that one. Come on. They looked amazing.
I'm just looking forward to after this Worlds when all TL fans are saying kick Doublelift and all TSM fans are saying kick Bjergsen. So that'll be a fun time. And it'll go full circle.
I want to rant a little bit about this thing that you mentioned about like the Doublelift thing, because it's like, I kind of lost my train of thought. It's like, I don't think like even if they had like Doublelift back there, it would have changed anything. And like the problem with like League of Legends fans, or that fans in general, is that, and there's obviously, and I say this in the least offensive way possible, is that they're all so fucking stupid. I swear to God. Like, why
is he put that ridiculous disclaimer and then said that? I'm sorry. I know there's no one in the world who could ever say, listen, no offense, but you're an absolute fucking cretin. Like, they're just deleting all that part, aren't they? They're just hearing the last part. But okay, carry on with this bold fucking late gambit in the game. Like, all fans are just morons,
Like, you guys are all like a lot of like the LoL fans are really fucking stupid, and they just don't really understand, because they're all like, most of them are so fucking knee jerk when they try to like criticize something.
Yes.
Why is it always the draft? Like, why is that the first thing that people always go to?
Brokenshard. I'll say this, okay. I'll believe it or not, I'll step in as some sort of mad fucking designated voice of reason to now attempt to de-escalate your radical statements here, Ram. So what I'll do is I'll just say this. I think that what you're trying to say is that in some cases, League of Legends fans are overly enthusiastic to find a solution before they've really looked at all the circumstances. And so they fall into a cardinal error, which, you know what, many of us, myself included, in our younger days, less experienced, perhaps fell into, which is you look for what you think is the one factor. Now, whether that means you really in your brain think there's only one factor, no, maybe not. But you're thinking, right, if I can find the main factor, that will tell me what the problem is. So in this case, as you're alluding to, they look for the draft. Like, was there a champion that got out of control in their team? In the case of TSM, well, I know all these other players are sick. All these other players are champions, in fact, so it must be the jungler. Again, the point here is, it's probably, first of all, some gradation of every single one of these problems. And even worse, you can obviously get that weird scenario where you could actually have 3 very small problems that in themselves aren't game destroying, but collectively they could make a bigger problem that kills you. So how would you unpack some of this? What do you think? What are they missing, or what are they pinpointing that they're going too far with?
People kind of fucking point to player skill way too quickly. Okay. When the game has evolved to the point where it's like not totally reliant on how good you are as a player, but how you use your strengths in a team environment. Because it's like the team with Double Lift and Biofrost, individual skill was not a problem there. And it definitely was not a problem with this Ven and Mithy era. And I don't understand why fans or people outwards are looking at it and like the kick Double Lift, bring him on, or why did you kick Double Lift, he should have gone on. It's like, why are you focusing on player skill and not going deeper? Like, it's not player skill. Individual skill is not the problem on these top teams. It never is. The only like a way I don't know how to do this is guns, I guess. Like, because if you have like a fucking big ass machine gun and you try to put in grenades into it and try to fire it, like grenades are strong, machine guns are strong, but a machine gun's not going to shoot grenades out of its fucking barrel. That makes sense. Yes. So it's like if these powerhouses don't work together, they're just like all firing on different cylinders and it doesn't work. In some cases, too much individual skill can be a problem because then everyone's kind of trying to do their own thing, you know? And it really triggers me super hard when League of Legends fans jump to this conclusions, or just fans in general, where it's like it always has to be a player skill issue, because at the end of the day, that's kind of like the only thing that they really understand. And maybe I was a bit too harsh when I say LoL fans are fucking stupid, but there are a lot of of course I was, and there are a lot of stupid people out there, but it's like they don't know what we know when it comes to like team building and roster coaching and stuff, like what me and Kelsey know just from what we've experienced, where it's like we know better that it's not an individual skill problem majority of the time when it comes to TSM. And so it needs to be like kind of ingrained that it's like, that's why it triggers the most. It's like I feel like maybe I'm holding the community to a higher standard than they should be. Like maybe, they just don't know better. And that's why they think that, Double Lift would have solved everything. If they had Double Lift, then this wouldn't have gone to shit. They'd have gone to Worlds where they'd have failed to make out of groups again, but it doesn't matter.
But it's not just fans, right? Everyone is really influenced by narrative to the point where, like, I almost think that players just kind of mentally combust against certain other players because they have like this kind of narrative around them, like that they're untouchable or that they're so good, and that kind of thing really affects your mentality. Like I do think that there is something to the idea where there is people say like NA always flunk out at Worlds at group stage, and then they do. People said for a really long time, people said that like SKT always make ridiculous comebacks, and they do. Like it for a while, it kind of like, I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it sort of feeds itself.
Yes, where I can understand that. Yeah,
you get a mental block to it, and then like when you talk to certain players, if the Reddit narrative is that, we lost because Double Lift is bad, like players read Reddit and they start to think, okay, maybe like he should have flashed there or something like this, and it starts to affect them a little bit. And sometimes players don't even like watch other games, right? They'll just see that like a certain player is getting an insane amount of praise on Reddit, and they'll really want to play with that player next year,
Yeah.
Even if they haven't like watched the other games in their own league, So it's like a lot of this kind of thing. We say fans, but it definitely affects orgs. It definitely affects staff. It definitely affects players as well. And a lot of people are very knee-jerk in deciding what the problem is, I think. A lot of people are really knee-jerk in deciding what their problems are. And some of that is just like how much the season is packed and how little off time there is for certain top teams, where you don't have the luxury of trying out other players. You don't have the luxury of trying other techniques. And there are no like throwaway tournaments. Obviously, there are a lot of games that are whatever in long seasons, but there's no way to like really try this sort of thing out. So you will jump really quickly to whatever solution makes most sense to you at the time, without necessarily thinking critically about it. And I think that isn't just a fan problem. That's a problem with human nature to an extent. Sure. So yeah.
Well, and also, like, there's two aspects that are very simple as well to explain, which is, like, one, that's just the way most people's brains work. I know everyone wants to believe they're all really rational and logical. Usually, you actually have to use your tools of rationality and logic to try and fucking diffuse narratives in your own brain and go, well, actually, have I ever looked at, like, is that too easy a narrative? Like, have I looked into all aspects? What if I look at the evidence against it? Does that make me think I have to weigh it up? You know, every now and then you have to sort of, like, vet your own opinions in that sense. And then also the other part is, obviously, people want a solution. They want there to be an actual answer. Whereas, like, I mean, for example, the reason why on the TSM one I brought up, for example, like the coaching staff aspect and then the history of the org is because that seems like an incredibly difficult, complex problem that I doubt there is one simple solution to. That's why, bizarrely, actually, Kelsey is probably right. Yeah, they actually just blow the whole team up, which doesn't mean Bjergsen's the problem, but it means, you know what, if you start with 5 brand new players, odds are you get different problems we're going to solve instead of that same one we're trying to constantly figure out what the issue is. So it's obviously a difficult scenario. I agree. Any final, should we just leave it on that? Actually, no, wait, I haven't asked you this. So since Cloud9 won the regional and are going to Worlds, by the way, I'm just going to say this, Jensen, obviously it was a joke and a throwaway line, but it's not really that sort of, there's not really that much swag attached with saying like, haha, regional is my kingdom. You sound shit then. I'd probably just try winning a split, mate. Because you know if you win the split, you just get straight to Worlds, right? You know? You don't actually have to play all those extra best of 5s. Yeah? You're aware of that? Okay, good. Because at the moment, mate, the narratives are actually that golden glue is actually like as good as you. So I'd probably block your ideas upon that one. But anyway, what about this Brokenshard? Cloud9 is a team that people obviously were already hyped for going into the finals. They're a team that people probably wanted to see at Worlds, but they do have a scenario, which me and Kelsey have discussed on past episode, where they are going to immediately hit the problem that they cannot use 2 different subs. For Worlds, you can only use 1 sub. Yep. Now, we speculated back and forth over, like, which do you do? Do you take the jungle sub or the mid sub? Now, I know technically they're taking all the players anyway, but you are going to have to commit to this and before the tournament begins, so if it's you, which do you pick? Do you take the mid or you take the jungle? So you take the jungle option.
Yeah,
why is that?
I don't even have to think about it because I think that there's a lot more that as a player, Jensen is a lot more flexible in what he can do and has a lot more experience. I think there is an inherent risk of bringing a rookie like Blabber to Worlds. Not that he didn't perform well this split. He's actually performed very well. It's more like there is more risk in just like bringing him as a standalone versus bringing him with Svenskeren. And as well, I feel like Jensen, to a certain point, if trained in that way, can do whatever Golden Glue does and better. I think that just as a player, Jensen is better, and I don't buy into that narrative that Golden Glue is as good as Jensen. Maybe Jensen has worse synergy with Svenskeren than Golden Glue does, or Golden Glue is more willing to play for Svenskeren, which kind of like alludes to the types of picks that Svenskeren is playing, you know, like the Lee Sin and stuff like that. But I feel like with the right push, why can't Jensen do what Golden Glue does? And what if Blabber doesn't have the same level of cohesive performance that he had in the last games, for example? And I also feel like Golden Blabber doesn't make as much sense as Svenskeren and Jensen.
Okay. Yes, well, that also, I guess that part also does naturally lead, right? Yeah. Because they were literally doing it like a line style or hockey style where you're bringing the players at the same time. Right. Kelsey, what do you actually think of Cloud9's strength going to Worlds then?
I think, honestly, I mean, I do feel like it's about the same as previous World Championships. Like, I do think you have some of the same, like, bot lane specific issues, except worse, because I do think, like, Zeyzal is just right now a worse player than Smoothie. So there are, like, situations where they will basically just lose mid lane matchups more frequently. There are times where it feels a little bit like people have drawn this comparison already, where it's like Blabber Svenskeren is like an NA version of MLXG Karsa, right?
Okay.
Where you have like situations where Blabber goes ham, but a lot of the times he just does stuff that doesn't make sense. He can't necessarily get back up in some of these decisions, so you have to have a mid laner who's like, you know, willing to go in. Svenskeren is a bit more controlled, but obviously he still has like some of those loose handle moments as well, just like Karsa does. But I actually still feel like they'll struggle to have like consistent presence in every single game that they play. They'll have a pretty good setup early on in the tournament, but it's a question of whether or not they'll have enough momentum to close out the group stage in more than just like a second place spot, depending on what their draw is. So.
Yeah, I think them getting out of groups is very reliant on draw, and it's not like we can expect anything ridiculous or crazy out of Cloud9. I would say that, like, in comparison to the other top 3 of NA, they look a little bit better than what G2 kind of looks like in comparison to the top 2 of EU, but it's like at the same time it's still Western teams at Worlds, and expectations specifically even for NA are relatively low compared to other regions.
This video was kindly supported by Gardner Wilson, Dean Tanglis, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, godawfulwasteofspace, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, James Harding, Daniel Yordanov, VeXii, Robert Baxter, and a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to appear in my content? Do you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers for upcoming content and guests? Want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today. Link in the description box.